you so much for being here.
It's good to be with you, Barry.
So we're here on the second anniversary of October 7th, the day, of course, when Hamas invaded Israel, slaughtered 1,200 Israelis, took another 250 hostage, and here we are 2 years later, and some 50 people, alive and dead, remain in Hamas captivity. Now, what those numbers don't capture at all is the way, at least it feels this way to me, that the world has tilted on its axis over the past 2 years. And I can really think of no one better to have that conversation with than you. For people who somehow don't know who you are the author of more than 16 books. Is that the accurate
I
number?
think that's the total, yes.
Including most recently.
I wrote a book recently called Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, which maybe is apposite.
Niall, you're also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and, of course, a columnist here at the Free Press. And we're just so happy to be able to have this conversation here with you tonight. So I guess maybe to start, a big but general question, which is we're here something like 730 days since that war began. It's still raging, although a peace plan may be coming together right now as we speak in Egypt. We'll get to that in a bit. But what are the lessons that we have learned since October 7th of 2023?
Well, it's a very difficult question because you and I, have probably learned very different lessons from a great many young people. I'm thinking particularly of young people at universities on both sides of the Atlantic who I think have learned radically different lessons. What I learned on October 7th, 2023 was that the possibility of a second Holocaust was much more real than I had assumed. As an historian who spent a decent chunk of my career teaching the history of the Third Reich and the Holocaust, who wrote a book, War of the World, about 20th century conflict, including the Holocaust, I spent many long days, weeks, months reading first-hand accounts of the Nazi war against the Jews. And what most shocked me about October 7th was the mimicry of those atrocities, of course on a tiny scale by comparison, but it seemed to me the conscious deployment of sexual violence as well as indiscriminate murder to send a signal that a second Holocaust was possible. That for me was the most important lesson, and I think that's how many of my Jewish friends and my Israeli friends in particular felt, and that is why it's such a caesura for so many people, including I'm sure some who are listening to this. And that for me was the takeaway, that Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and their backers, their supporters, including the Iranian regime, are intent on and do believe in a second Holocaust, at least the annihilation of the state of Israel, if not of the Jewish people. We then learned a few days later, and it was perhaps just as shocking in its way, that a great many young people did not see it that way, but on the contrary, turned victims into perpetrators and perpetrators into victims by rallying noisily and repeatedly in support of, well, not Hamas necessarily, but certainly in support of a Palestinian cause, and maybe more importantly, rallying against the state of Israel. And these rallies had anti-Semitic elements from the very outset, and they occurred in all kinds of different places, including elite universities. This was as shocking because it was so at odds with my reaction, and I think the reaction of many of my friends, including you, Barry. So this is the strange thing. It's as if on this same planet, two completely contradictory lessons have been learned.
Not just in the same planet, but sometimes, the person that you're sitting across from at dinner. It's a very disorienting feeling
Yes.
to feel like you live in a different reality. I want to drill down just a little bit more on, you wrote in one of the most important pieces I think we've ever published in the Free Press. It was called The Treason of the Intellectuals. And in that, and this is sort of what you do consistently, you look for the echoes of history in what we're experiencing in the present. So we were working on a piece today of yours, I hope it's coming out tomorrow, on our sort of post-literate age and to understand what it is to live in an era where we're giving up words for the sake of emojis. You had to go all the way back to people that used to paint, in caves rather than using words. And in this case, what you did is you drew on the history of intellectuals in Germany, and specifically university professors who joined the Nazi cause. I wondered if you could speak about that just for a minute, because I think it helps illuminate where, I think a lot of people on October 7th, really it began that day, but especially on October 8th and then every single day since then, people of the older generation and then just people in the Jewish community have asked themselves, where are young people getting these ideas? And I think a lot of the answer to that, especially among the most the most elite young people in our culture, is the universities themselves.
That's right. I think when I look back on the history of the Third Reich, it's always struck me as one of the most shocking features of that history that the elite universities of Germany, which were in the 1920s and early 1930s, universally regarded as the best in the world. They led in terms of, say, Nobel Prizes for sciences. They were such great universities that you weren't really fully educated as a physicist. Think Oppenheimer, if you hadn't spent time at one of the great German universities. The fact that those universities were supportive of the Nazi movement even before 1933 is one of the more shocking aspects of that story, because I think many of us assume that education is always good and in some sense inoculates you against bad ideas. That is not the case. On the contrary, what the history of Germany in the 1920s and 30s shows is that educational institutions were vectors for the transmission of radical nationalist ideas. Student groups in the 1920s began prohibiting Jewish membership, and professors who were not Jewish were enthusiastic supporters of Hitler and early to join the Nazi Party prior to Hitler's coming to power. And then those same universities, after Hitler's coming to power, participated in the exclusion of the Jews from the academic community and then the wider community itself. And German professors were enthusiastic, not only proponents of Nazism, but they realized it in a variety of different ways. On the basis of Hitler's somewhat inchoate ideology, it took professors to come up with theories of Lebensraum that justified the wholesale ethnic cleansing of populations, doctoral dissertations about the optimal way to deal with gold fillings in the bodies of cremated victims. So for me, one of the most powerful motivations for studying 20th century history was to explain how it could be that the country with the most sophisticated universities had ended up being so ready to embrace National Socialism, one of the most terrible ideologies and one of the most bloodthirsty regimes. So I say all this because when I looked at the reaction of Harvard students and Stanford students and students at Columbia to the events of October 7, 2 years ago, I had at first a moment of shock and then a moment of recognition. Most people would agree, the rankings certainly suggest this, that the elite American universities are the best in the world. There are very few in the top 10 rankings that aren't American these days. And so they occupy the same place that Heidelberg and Tübingen occupied back in the 1920s. And yet, these same elite institutions appear to be the places where it's easiest to mobilize young people in support of a Palestinian cause in an indiscriminate way that barely distinguishes between the idea of Palestinian statehood and support for Hamas, comes close to legitimizing the actions of Hamas as part of a, quote, global intifada. Now, people think of the Ivy League institutions, they think of them as liberal, progressive institutions, and therefore it's hard for them to see a parallel like the one I drew in that article for you, the parallel between the elite universities of America today in the 2020s, the elite universities of Germany 100 years ago, but there's a very striking parallel. Sure, the German universities thought themselves being right-wing, and our universities are full of people who think that they're left-wing. But does it really matter if the end station, if the terminus is anti-Semitism? Does it really matter if the ideology thinks of itself as liberal but ends up being deeply illiberal? So for me, this has been an important insight. And I do think when one's trying to understand why so many young people uncritically embrace slogans from the river to the sea, etc., that identify them with terrorist organizations, why so many young people have so quickly turned against Israel and turned against the idea of a Jewish state. You've got to seek the answer in the way that for years universities have taught the history of the Middle East, have assigned readings that are highly hostile to Israel. And also let's ask the question, where did so many student organizations get the funding to organize as well as they did? I'm still struck by how swiftly the narrative was established just days after October 7th, that the real victims were the people of Gaza, and the genocide was being perpetrated by Israel, not against it. That happened so fast that it can't really be attributed to spontaneous student organization, and therefore one has to look at the sources of funding for these organizations.
Is that a story of Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood?
Yes.
Or is that also the story? Well, let's talk about that, because I think that's part of the story. I think the other part of the story is the way that the sort of credentialing journals and institutions have been transformed. So the most egregious of these in recent days, I think it's the Journal of Genocide Studies. I might be getting the name slightly wrong. And this journal that was vaunted in the press as being elite and established and unimpeachable, well, it turned out that you could join this association of genocide studies by paying a nominal fee. And so in the days after this organization declared that there was a genocide happening in Gaza, people kind of tested if they could join it. And you saw hilarious things like, characters from Sesame Street joining. Hitler joined the Association of Genocide Studies. I bring that up not to in any way diminish the horrific bloodshed that's happened over the war to innocent people happening in Gaza, but to illuminate the way that even terms like genocide have been torqued and transformed in order to serve political ends. So let's maybe talk about two things. One, the sort of subversion is the word that your wife, Ayan Hirsi Ali, has used, the subversion of our institutions for the sake of political ends, and then also the foreign funding that has been a story that has gone almost entirely overlooked.
I think the foreign funding is on a massive scale, and Ayan has written about this and made the argument that we're dealing here with a massive influence operation, heavily funded by Qatar, which in effect has created a network of Muslim Brotherhood aligned organizations, some of them embedded in academic life and others operating in the public domain. The way this works, or has worked, I think, has been to take advantage of certain norms and assumptions of American liberalism. So if you can make the case that, for example, you're simply doing for Muslims what was previously done for American Jews by the Anti-Defamation League, or for African Americans, then you can cast your efforts as part of a long-standing tradition of emancipation or civil rights, and that's an argument that is very hard, I think, to resist. One can see Democratic Party officials lining up to endorse the Council of American Islamic Relations, which I think it's reasonable to at least suggest is aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. In the same way that in Britain, the Labour Party finds it very difficult to resist pressure from those constituencies that have large Muslim populations on this issue. Why did the British government recently recognise a Palestinian state? The answer is pressure from the left. So there's a lot going on here that we need to understand. That means following the money. And it also means, I think, trying to trace the thinking that goes on in the minds of young people. I still reel a bit when I see slogans like Queers for Palestine. It takes me back to years ago when Ayan and I were trying to understand the campaign against her, the campaign to represent her as an Islamophobe, which seemed to unite Islamists and professors of queer studies. And I remember struggling to understand how this could possibly be the case. And it's partly, I think, because the Islamists have been very effective at speaking the language of the radical left. But it's also because the radical left is full of useful idiots who don't understand the absurdity of a slogan like Queers for Palestine, don't understand the fundamental hostility, indeed intolerance of radical Islam towards any kind of sexual deviancy. So that's where we are. I think we haven't really solved the problem, and that's important 2 years on to emphasize. I've just come from England. Jews in England are still reeling from the attack on the synagogue in Manchester, and I think reeling just as much from the fact that protests, pro-Gaza, anti-Israel protests happened immediately afterwards, and then have happened again today on the anniversary of October 7th. So this is the thing that's going on, not only in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom and in other countries too.
The people protesting in the streets, if you go up to them and you say, you challenge them, they will of course say, why would you ever accuse me of being anti-Semitic? I have no problem with Jews. I only have a problem with Israel. And that's what a lot of young people who are not deeply following this issue. What is your answer to the people that say that? How do you explain that marching several hours later against Israel is directly connected in its way to what happened at that synagogue in Manchester?
It's hard to make this kind of argument. By and large, the kind of people that you're talking about aren't deeply into reasoned debate. My sense is that the hostility to Israel, or you can be even more specific, towards Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government, is something that these crowds enjoy giving vent to. I'm always struck by the energy in these protests, and also the reluctance to remember where this all began. There's a kind of effacing of the suffering of the victims of October 7th inherent in all of these protests, an insistence that their suffering is of no consequence compared with the suffering of the people of Gaza. And I agree with you, Barry, when you say we don't want to dismiss the suffering of the people of Gaza. What's happened in Gaza has been a tragedy, as is always the case when war is waged in an urban environment with dense populations. I think that one can reasonably argue that the Israeli Defense Forces have done their utmost to minimize civilian casualties, but they were never going to avoid civilian casualties in that context. I think one could also argue that the Netanyahu government made mistakes. Indeed, there are plenty of Israelis who would agree if you said that, including people who've been in that government. It was always going to be impossible simultaneously to rescue the hostages and destroy Hamas. That these were contradictory objectives from the outset.
Yes.
I think one can say all of these things without slipping into apologetics and justifications for Hamas. But that's all too often what one hears. At the heart of these protests, one can see it in the kind of posters that are circulated to encourage people to turn out to such rallies, is an argument that the conduct of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad 2 years ago was justified by the behavior of the settler colonist Israeli regime and its genocidal policies. And that attempt to justify acts of hideous violence is the thing that I find most objectionable. One can criticize the way that Israel has handled this, but the notion that the implicit counterfactual that an Israeli government might have done nothing, might not have reacted, might not have attempted to take action against the perpetrators of those hideous crimes is preposterous. And of course, if similar things were done to Americans on a comparable scale, there would be overwhelming public pressure for a military response. We saw that after 9/11, though people have forgotten that history too.
Douglas Murray wrote today in the Free Press that what began on October 7th, in retrospect, wasn't one war, but two wars. The first is the war, he says, that the state of Israel has been fighting against its enemies, including Iran and its proxies. And he goes on to argue that that's a war that is being won. But the second is the war that's been fought against Jews in the wider West. And that one is one that feels like it's being lost. Do you agree with that?
I do. I worry a lot that Prime Minister Netanyahu is achieving a strategic victory in the Middle East that I've likened to Bismarck's victory in mid-19th century Europe, a victory based on blood and iron, a victory in which a clear military supremacy and superiority of Israel establishes it as the dominant power that you meddle with at your peril. The price of this strategic success is a chronic loss of legitimacy for Israel as a state and a reignition of anti-Semitism around the world, which poses a serious threat to Jews living everywhere, including in a country like England, which I think I had assumed for much of my life would never witness such scenes.
I mean, I know, just to add a little context to that, that attack in Manchester, of course, happened on Yom Kippur. By the time I left synagogue and saw the news, I had several pitches for people who wanted to write essays about why they're leaving England.
Yeah.
And even before the attack, it would be very, very common in dinner parties and text threads with British Jews to have them casually talk about, plans for leaving, plans for escape, where they're going to go.
I've had these conversations, and that's, I think, what Douglas is talking about. I would also say that there's a nightmare scenario, and it was coming close to being realized, that Israel ends up where South Africa was in the apartheid era, an international pariah. That's a very dangerous thing for Israel, because although it can seem like modern-day Prussia in the region, it still relies heavily on the United States for support. The scale of aid, military aid in particular, shouldn't be underestimated, even although Israel is much less reliant on it than it was, say, in 1973, when another great surprise attack on Israel occurred. And the United States may not be as reliable an ally of Israel in the coming years when you look at what is happening in the Democratic Party, and particularly amongst younger Democratic voters. To me, the big alarming shift...
And among young people on the right.
I was coming to that because I think that's not so visible in the polling.
No,
I mean,
but
the
it's
polling...
it's visible online.
It's visible online, but if one looks at Democrats, one of the biggest changes we've seen since October 7th, 2 years ago, is a big shift in attitudes. The Democratic Party has gone towards being quite distinctly pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel.
The party of Zoran Mamdani as opposed to the
Correct.
party of John Fetterman.
Right. And that's a big change, and it's full of peril for Israel if one thinks ahead to a time when conceivably a left-leaning democratic administration exists. I would be very nervous indeed for Israel at that moment. So this war, the second war that Douglas is talking about, is going badly. And I think that's part of what's important about President Trump's peace initiative, that he's trying, I think, and I think admirably and skillfully, to bring an end to this conflict in order, I think, partly to prevent Israel becoming a full international pariah, because I do think that's a tremendously dangerous thing. So we have a
And
2 years on, a very, very precarious situation. Israel has in many ways achieved tremendous strategic success. Let's just step back for a moment, because the war in Gaza is only part of a seven-front war that Israel has been waging against multiple opponents, and it's been doing tremendously well in most of these conflicts. I mean, the most obvious and dramatic change that we've seen in the last 2 years was the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, which almost nobody expected to happen, and happened very suddenly. The destruction of near destruction of Hezbollah, another extraordinary Israeli win. The utter humiliation of the Iranian regime, the exposure that its air offensive capability was minimal in terms of the damage it could inflict on Israel, and its air defenses were also minimal in terms of what they could do to prevent Israel attacking. I mean, these are major victories, and one can't really fault the Israeli government. Its counterattack in this multi-front war has been tremendously successful. The problem is that the media on both sides of the Atlantic have focused almost exclusively on Gaza, have often turned into channels for Hamas statistics, which I think need to be regarded with extreme skepticism. And that means that Israel's been winning the first war and, as Douglas said, losing the second war.
Let's talk maybe a little bit about that peace plan. I think as we're sitting here, maybe they've already landed. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are flying to Egypt to see if they can enact this 20 or 21 point peace plan. Senior officials told reporters a few hours ago that we're, quote, the closest we've ever been to the end of the war. Do you think we should be optimistic?
Well, it's a rash person who's optimistic about the Middle East, and I think one has to assume
No one would ever accuse you of optimism on any score, Neil.
it's hard to be an optimist after spending your adult life as an historian. There are plenty of things that can still go wrong. As far as I can see, Hamas has taken an a la carte approach to accepting the points it likes and not the ones it doesn't like. However, I think Jared Kushner's involvement is an terribly encouraging sign, because he must get a good deal of the credit for the Abraham Accords that were such a success in the first Trump administration. And he has such high standing, particularly in the Gulf, but more broadly, that one senses that real progress is now happening. President Trump has understood ever since he came into the White House that the path to stability in the Middle East runs through the Gulf, that you need to have the cooperation of the Saudis, of the Emiratis, and he believes the Qataris for this to be possible. You can't simply bet on Israel. And so I think we're seeing here the continuation of the very successful Middle East policy of the first Trump term, which was then punctuated by the very disastrous Middle East policy of the Biden-Harris administration. We're getting back on track. Maybe it's possible to imagine a year from now that the conversations that broke down 2 years ago between Saudi Arabia and Israel can be resumed. So this is, I think, a reason to be relatively as optimistic as one dare be in this context. I also think that President Trump has done one of his characteristic tricks. It's not all that long ago that he was shocking and outraging polite society with the Gaza Riviera idea, Well, if you put an idea like that out there, and then months later come up with something as sophisticated as this plan, everybody's immensely relieved. So that seems to have worked in Trump's favor. So I think he also has seen a vulnerability on the Israeli side. The attacks on Hamas leadership in Doha and Qatar created an opportunity for President Trump to apply real pressure on Mr. Netanyahu, who has had to agree to things that members of his government do not accept. So it's a classic example of the extraordinary difficulty of the Middle East peace process. It's reminiscent of some of the extraordinary ducking and weaving that Henry Kissinger had to do half a century ago. But I'm impressed by what's been achieved so far, and I venture to be hopeful that really grim deadlock that seemed interminable in Gaza is coming to an end, and that the hostages, such of them as survive, are finally going to be released. That will be a huge win for President Trump if he can achieve it.
Would it merit him winning the Nobel Peace Prize in your view?
Well, I often say that President Trump consciously and sometimes subconsciously owes a debt to Richard Nixon, and there are many Nixonian elements to the president, not the least of which is his desire to be seen as a peacemaker. Of course, Richard Nixon's fate was to have the Peace Prize go to Henry Kissinger, which galled Nixon immensely. Perhaps in this case, history will rhyme, and Jared Kushner will get the Peace Prize. But at any event, I think this fetishization of the Nobel Peace Prize is probably a mistake on the president's part. He should not think so much about that. That's not what matters actually to your historical legacy. I mean, who for now thinks that President Obama's presidency was a foreign policy triumph? He got the Peace Prize, but then, of course, he didn't deliver peace. He delivered utter failure in the case of Syria, utter failure in Ukraine, did nothing when Crimea was annexed. So prizes don't matter. You know, prizes matter when you're in high school. They matter less and less as you grow up. What matters is your historical legacy. If 10, 20, 30 years from now, historians say, against all expectations, President Donald Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and their friend Steve Witkoff were able to succeed where a generation of diplomats had failed, that's what matters.
What does it tell us about the cohort of people that become diplomats, that potentially a real estate guy who's the president and another real estate guy and yet another kind of real estate guy will have accomplished more than a lot of them? What does it say about conventional wisdom and groupthink in that cohort?
I don't want to be critical of those who devoted their lives at state or indeed at CIA to the problems of the Middle East. I think we need to remind ourselves of how many twists and turns there have been in US policy towards the region, going all the way back to the origins of the state of Israel and the commitment that President Truman made at the outset. Let's not forget that in the wake of the 9/11 attacks 24 years ago, the United States embarked on what I thought at the time was an overambitious bid to reshape the Middle East, at least in some measure in America's image through regime change in Iraq. One looks back on the neoconservative interlude and asks what was achieved. I actually think more than we acknowledge. I wrote another essay for you, Barry, recently saying, actually, we won the war on terror. It was much more successful than anybody wants to acknowledge. But it left Americans with a very bitter taste, and it left us deeply reluctant to be so militarily involved in the region again. And yet, why is it that President Trump has been successful, particularly in the Middle East, in a way that Joe Biden was not? Well, I think one reason is that President Trump was willing to display American military might at its most formidable by bombing Fordo. That happened only a few weeks after the Financial Times was jeering at the the taco trade, Trump always chickens out. But he didn't chicken out, and he delivered an incredibly powerful blow against the Iranian regime. I think that focused a lot of minds in the region. And that's the thing that we keep coming back to. In the final analysis, diplomacy is not the alternative to military force. The two act together. The most successful presidents have understood that and have used them together. And I think that's what we've seen with President Trump.
There have been lots of words used to describe sort of the Trumpian approach to the globe. Some have described him as an isolationist, a neo-isolationist, others as a realist. Now many people in sort of the MAGA world, especially those on the more isolationist train, are turning against him because they say, in fact, he was always a closet neoconservative. What's the right way for us to understand the Trumpian approach to foreign policy? How will historians remember his worldview, such as it is?
I never found it persuasive that President Trump was an isolationist. I think he's always signaled where the inspiration comes from. I've mentioned the Nixonian element. I think that's important because part of what we've seen this year has been a very Nixonian set of shocks to America's allies, to the Europeans. The party's over. You guys have to pay for your own defense. Very Nixonian. The desire to be the peacemaker in the Middle East, very Nixonian. The desire to go to China, very Nixonian. But there's another element here which is important, which is the McKinley factor. When President Trump was campaigning last year, he said, William McKinley's my guy, tariff man. And McKinley was also a very imperial president who, as president, presided over the Spanish-American War, the acquisition of real estate, keeps coming up, doesn't it, real estate, in Puerto Rico and Guam. And so Trump's not an isolationist. If anything, he's a kind of strange blend of the late 19th century and the 1970s. I think those people within the administration, and there are some, who yearn to simplify American policy into a Western Hemisphere strategy and, the hell with the rest of the world, are bound to be disappointed because the United States doesn't have the option to opt out of the rest of the world. It's not the 19th century anymore. The United States is a global superpower. And whatever the president's inclinations, whoever the president is, and this is clear going all the way back 50 or more years, there are parts of the world that draw you back in, no matter how hard you try to get out. The Middle East is the obvious case. Presidents are always trying to pivot out of it, and back they go. Europe is the second, and then the third is the Far East. And I would say you could characterize American foreign policy as a three-body problem. The United States has to deal with three very powerful gravitational forces, one drawing it towards Europe, one drawing it to the Middle East.
This is a very good piece.
And a third that draws it towards the Far East, to East Asia. And no president can just ignore those gravitational forces. Each president has to decide which one am I going to prioritize, because I can't possibly be involved in conflicts in all three. But that's how I think one should think about President Trump. He's not an isolationist. I don't think he's ever been an isolationist. He's a protectionist, certainly. He's a nativist on immigration, sure. He certainly has, in many ways, reverted to 19th century type in his attitudes towards monetary policy. I think Trump, in many ways, is a late 19th century figure who somehow has stumbled into the politics of the 2020s. But that's what we see here. And I think it's the Nixon impulse. I'm going to be a peacemaker. I'm going to get us out of these forever wars that has impelled him to be such a decisive influence in the Middle East. And I want to restate, Barry, because I think it's important. If one thinks back to the first Trump term, the success in the Middle East ran entirely counter to the commentary of your old friends, frenemies at the New York Times. I remember
the whole linkage idea.
Well, yes, and the negativity with which the Kushner plan was initially greeted. I think I was about the only person who wrote an op-ed saying, hey, this could work. The cynicism about of established commentary on Trump's Middle East policy is extraordinary when you consider its success. The Abraham Accords were a dramatic breakthrough that ended Israel's isolation, created meaningful bridges to the Arab world, and ultimately isolated Iran. So what happened under Biden was this was all derailed 2 years ago. I think, by the way, that part of the point of October 7th was to derail that process. I think that was part of what motivated the attacks. If President Trump can get it back on course and we can resume a conversation about Israel's relations with Saudi Arabia, this will be an extraordinary diplomatic achievement.
Without naming names, the kind of just to spell it out for people tuning in, I think the conventional wisdom before the Abraham Accords was that if you wanted Israel's acceptance or normalization with countries in the Gulf, it all sort of ran through the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And until you solved that problem, none of the other relationships could happen.
And
but in fact, it kind of went the opposite way.
You had to solve it by recognizing, creating a Palestinian state. That was the... And that's still, by the way, a kind of default assumption in Europe, which is why you've got this bizarre phenomenon of recognition of the Palestinian state at a time when its non-existence is one of the most striking features of the region, and its total loss of legitimacy in the eyes of Israelis. I haven't met since October 7th 2 years ago any Israeli who really believes in a two-state solution. So I think the conventional view was completely wrong. And I remember having a meeting with Jared Kushner early on in this process where he explained his vision, which was, let's try and make the Palestinians less central. Let's try to make them an economic problem. Let's try to address their concerns, but not make them the central issue. Let's focus on the economic opportunities that exist, particularly given the need of the Gulf states to diversify away from hydrocarbons. And I think that insight that you could really make the road to peace run through Riyadh rather than through Gaza was a brilliant one and proved to be correct. I think if you read Jared Kushner's excellent memoir, he gives credit where it's due. There were a lot of very important players in the drama in the Gulf states themselves. I think particularly in the Emirates and in Saudi, there was a realization that the Islamists were a very grave threat to the stability of those regimes themselves. And so their toughness towards radical Islam was an important precursor of the Abraham Accords. And then their recognition that if they were going to have a future beyond being a gas station, they needed to partner with the most technologically advanced country, which, as our mutual friend Dan Senior long has argued, was Israel. And Israel as a startup nation with a real technological edge was the natural partner. So these are the shifts that went on, that the kind of establishments of Middle East commentary, and particularly the academic establishment, wholly failed to understand. Coming back to something we were talking about earlier, my observation is that there is no more politicized part of American academia than Middle East studies or the history of the Middle East. And I've seen this at first hand on appointment committees. It is astonishingly difficult for any university to get a program in these fields that is not highly politicized and nearly always in the direction of the Palestinian cause. So this is part of, I think, the reason for the disconnect. The real estate guys just didn't have this baggage and were able to approach the problem from first principles. They had not read
Edward Said's Orientalism, probably not.
I suspect, I might be wrong, but I rather doubt that Donald Trump has read Orientalism by Edward Said.
So let's, just going back to the three-body problem, let's talk about the last of those three bodies, which of course is China. There's an argument that's been put forward by, some powerful people in Washington and in the expert class, people especially, I'm thinking of Bridge Colby, who make the following argument. America is limited in its resources. We cannot be everywhere in the world. Given that we cannot be everywhere in the world at once, we have to focus our capital, our energy, our national security concerns on the most important and grave threat, and that threat is China. Therefore, even the conversation we've just had for the past 30 minutes about the Middle East is kind of a distraction from the main thing. You have argued many times that we are in a ongoing Cold War with China. Do you agree with that assessment that Colby and others have made?
Well, I know Bridge Colby, and we've debated this in the past, and I have assigned his book, Strategy of Denial, to students. My sense is that if you focus all of your attention on China, and in particular on Taiwan, there's a danger of the self-fulfilling prophecy where you end up in that conflict because you decided to prioritize that issue. Now, I think since entering government, he has somewhat softened his position, not surprisingly considering that President Trump seems inclined to pursue détente with China and is not, I think, especially engaged on the issue of Taiwan. I don't think one can easily separate these three bodies. I don't think you can turn one off or turn two off and just focus on a third because they are interrelated. One of the more disastrous consequences of the Biden-Harris presidency was the emergence of the axis of authoritarians, which didn't exist prior to 2021, but became very visible after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are an axis. They work together very openly in military and economic ways. And the war in Ukraine is only one of their projects. After all, China relies on Iranian oil for its insatiable appetites
I was just
for
going to say that
energy.
there was an unbelievable report in the WSJ yesterday that China has built a secret $8.4 billion payment system to buy Iranian oil to avoid U.S. sanctions. So
that-
it's like, how can you
Yeah.
say that China is disconnected from the Middle East?
These things are all deeply intertwined, and that is, I think, why any national security strategy is bound to be global. You can't simply focus on the Western Hemisphere. That, I think, is also a naive aspiration. The United States has powerful interests around the globe in the form of its allies, and it also cannot afford for China to establish a kind of Greater East Asia co-prosperity zone that stretches all the way from Beijing to the river Dnieper. If you think about world politics in a highly schematized way, people love to talk about geopolitics these days who've never read much about it. But if you want to reduce geopolitics to its essentials, it's the idea of Mackinder's world island. He who controls the Eurasian landmass is master, versus Speakman's rimlands. That's the Western Europe, Japan, and of course the United States. And that seems to me a helpful way to think about the world today, with China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, a Eurasian axis, and the countries that have supported Ukraine are very obviously the rimlands. That, if you think about that geopolitical framework and think of the United States as being the leader of the rimlands, we must seek to avoid a total Chinese domination of the Eurasian landmass. It's dangerously close to coming, because if they achieve that, then our mighty sanctions will not be effective against them. We've based our war-winning strategy on China for years on the idea of a blockade, that we can somehow cut off their life support on the Strait of Malacca. I think it's been convincingly argued in a forthcoming book by Ike Fryman and Harry Hellam that strategy is obsolescent, if not obsolete, as China makes itself more and more sanctions-proof. And as this axis becomes better and better organized as a military-industrial complex, it's now clearly a bigger manufacturing complex than the United States and its allies because of the scale of China's manufacturing capability. So if one takes a step back and asks, where are we going, then we must seek to avoid a conflict, a large-scale conflict, a world war, against an axis which is so much more formidable than the axis of 1939-40. Far, far more formidable. Chinese manufacturing value added is kind of close to twice that of the United States today. 20 years ago, manufacturing value added of the United States was twice that of China. That's a huge reversal of fortune. And what we've learned in the Middle East, and even more clearly in Ukraine, is that war is still a hardware problem. I mean, you need good software, but if you don't have the hardware, if you run out of your exquisite precision missiles after a week, and the other side is able to mass produce millions of drones, it's hard to see how we prevail. That's the world that Donald Trump inherited. And I think, unlike many of his critics, he has understood quite clearly the limits of American power, that we can't simultaneously be piling resources into Ukraine, piling resources into the Middle East, and also trying to turn Taiwan into a kind of porcupine that China dare not challenge. That's too much, particularly given Ferguson's law, which states that any great power that spends more on interest payments on its debt than on defense won't be great for much longer. And that's where we are, folks. The United States is in that situation of spending a rising share of its GDP on interest payments relative to defense.
So let's draw out Ferguson's law a little further. You wrote a piece for us recently, and you write a lot of things that fill me with a sense of dread in a good way. But this may be more than most, because you basically said something that's obvious to historians but is alarming as an American to read, which is that, you know, history shows that republics don't last for more than 250 years. You argued in this piece that we're in a late stage republic like Rome, and that history sort of betting against us continuing in this state for much longer. Explain that a little more.
Well, republics historically were much shorter lived than 250 years on average. I mean, most republics didn't last nearly that long. And that was one reason that the founders had a very, very deliberate constitutional design in mind. That the traditional problem with republics was either they became too democratic and descended into anarchy, or they became too monarchical and descended into tyranny. And so the founders came up with a design which was supposed to prevent that through the separation of powers. So the president would never have too much power, and the legislature would never have too much power, and there would be a judicial branch that would check both. Unique design has been extraordinarily successful and explains the amazing durability of the American Republic. I go through periods of fretting about the Roman predicament. I did a recent lecture for PragerU saying I think on balance we're not Rome, and I don't think Trump is Octavian stroke Augustus. But the thing that I keep worrying about is not actually Trump and his ambitions. It's the weakness of the legislature. Tacitus says that the reason that Augustus and then Tiberius are ultimately given imperial power is that the Roman elites are decadent and basically handed over. I worry about that tendency. It's the weakness of Congress that is the problem in our system today, not the strength of the executive branch. And the increasing power of the executive branch predates Trump. So these are the tendencies that I worry about. These get, I think, misunderstood because the media want to focus on Trump's personality and I think represent him as a would-be dictator. That's not the problem. The problem is a certain atrophying of the power of the legislative branch. And the classic illustration of this, Barry, is tariffs. I mean, the Constitution says it very clearly that's the job of Congress. It should not be the president who imposes tariffs. And the fact that Congress acquiesces in this presidential power grab is one of many examples of Congress surrendering power to the executive branch. A Roman of the old school would look at that with considerable concern.
It's really hard, I think, for people that are trying to keep up with the news and given sort of the histrionics of a lot of headlines to understand what should really be alarming us. Help people that are tuning in as we start to wrap up to focus their minds on what is really keeping you up at night. Because that's probably the thing that we should be paying more attention to than whatever's trending right now on Twitter.
I do think that the historians of the 2020s, a generation hence, will probably spend more time talking about the unintended consequences of artificial intelligence than about the latest shutdown in Washington, D.C., or even the Epstein files. I mean, we are undergoing another huge technological upheaval. And I wrote in The Square and the Tower that we hadn't fully understood the implications of the internet, even as we were building it, its consequences were very different from what we were told. You'll remember that the internet was supposed to turn us all into netizens, and to be a highly decentralized, distributed network in which everybody would be able
How'd
to
that
kind
go?
of... Yeah, it turned out it was very quickly centralized into giant network platforms, which by 2021 had the potential to be a total censorship regime. So here we are with artificial intelligence, and as always, the sellers of hype will tell you that it's going to be in every way wonderful to have agents, co-pilots, turning us all into the writers of essays that only a few of us are born to be. So the unintended consequences of AI seem to me to be a thing to worry about, because, and this is the essay that you and I have just been working on, it's possible now to get people away from literacy. And that's recent. Up until very recently, the internet was still text-based. And even now, we're still prompting with, typed prompts. But the technology now exists pretty much to decouple humanity from the written word, and to turn us into people who only listen to podcasts, which are unscripted, pretty much in this case unscripted, and issue their instructions verbally, and communicate in emojis and video clips. Now, that end of literacy, that transition away from a letters-based, written word-based society, I think, is pregnant with disaster, because if we lose the ability to communicate in written sentences, then I think we very quickly revert to the pre-literate order. And in the essay, I try to show what a pre-literate world is like. And one of the key points that I came to realize right in that essay is that thinking critically is impossible without the written word. Without the written word to record the past and allow us to distinguish the present from the past, without the written word to formalize our thoughts, we cannot have formal, rigorous thinking. That seems to me much more worrying. A post-literate or pre-literate society, a society that has given up the written word and given up all the operating systems associated with it, that's the kind of society where it's easy to imagine dictatorship flourishing. A republic, if you can keep it, was Benjamin Franklin's famous response to the lady who asked what they'd achieved in drawing up the Constitution. I don't think you can keep a republic if the population, if the citizenry become functionally illiterate. That's what I worry about.
Just as a closer, I'd love to sort of connect what you just said to where you opened, which is you said that one of the chilling lessons that you've drawn from the post-October 7th world is that a second Holocaust is more possible in the enlightened West than you ever thought possible. Is there connection? First, there's two parts to the question. One is, what is the connection between a post-literate society and that? Because I think that you'll have much to say on that. And then the second thing is just more personal, I guess, for me and for anyone watching that desperately wants to avoid such a thing, is what can be done about it. Because sometimes it feels to me that the way history moves is, I don't want to say that it's inevitable. We move it, we shape it. But sometimes the bigness of it lately just feels so profound and so beyond our abilities. And I wonder, as a historian, but also as someone who's so aware that we're living inside history and has studied, especially in Kissinger, people that have shaped it, how do you function as a person, as a civilian, trying to push it in the right direction?
There was a terrific Cambridge anthropologist, Jack Goody, who made the point that in pre-literate societies there was no clear distinction between myth and reality. You couldn't juxtapose myth and reality without the written word. I think this is a very profound insight, and it connects to October 7th and the resurgence of anti-Semitism on the left and, as you mentioned rightly, on the right in the following way. Only a society that was having its literate culture hollowed out would be susceptible to the claim made by Daryl Cooper on Tucker Carlson's podcast that Hitler is the true hero of World War II and Winston Churchill a Jewish-sponsored villain. You would have to be completely illiterate of the history of the Second World War to swallow that lie. Conspiracy theories have been in the ascendant for some time. I think they've benefited from the internet. But what makes you susceptible to a conspiracy theory is that you are actually post-literate or pre-literate. You haven't really read the books that would make you skeptical about the protocols of the elders of Zion, or skeptical about some of the claims that are now being made by Carson and other people on what Jim Lindsay calls the woke right. So that's the answer to your first question. The problem is that people are highly susceptible to old conspiracy theories. Of course, conspiracy theories have for centuries made Jews the villains if they have not read any real history. And that I think is part of what concerns me about the way history is taught in our schools, in our universities. It is no longer being taught in the way that might make people able to defend their minds against this kind of mind poison. And the second thing you asked is, what can we do? Well, it sounds banal, but I think reading books is not a bad start. After all, what made me able to recognize the intentions of the perpetrators on October the 7th, 2023, was I read a lot of accounts of the violence against Jews that occurred in the early stages of the Holocaust, before the Holocaust was industrialized at Auschwitz, when the Holocaust was a series of wild pogroms directed against the Jews of Eastern Europe. If you've read accounts of those hideous events, then you know what a pogrom is like. You don't need to have experienced one. You've read about it. I think reading first-hand accounts of historical events is still the most powerful way to prepare yourself for what the present and future may throw at you. And I don't think people read enough. I don't think they read nearly enough of the kind of books I read when I was researching War of the World, the kind of books I assigned when I was teaching the Third Reich special subject at Oxford. I'll just give you one example. The one thing that I would urge people to read, the Diaries of Victor Klemperer, who was a Jewish, although converted to Christianity, but defined as Jewish professor in Dresden in the 1930s and 1940s, are a wonderful account of what it is to be a Jew in a society where your rights are whittled away. You start thinking you're a German with full civil rights. That's the diaries begin pre-Hitler. And then with every passing week after 1933, your rights are whittled away until you have none at all, and are made to wear a yellow star and are waiting for deportation to the death camps. I think those are some of the most important books that have ever been published about the experience of life in a totalitarian regime. People who get confused, who think somehow we're on a path to totalitarianism, should read those volumes. It's a good reality check. And we should read those volumes wherever we live and ask ourselves the question, is some similar process at work? Is that the feeling that Jews in Britain have started to feel? I begin to think that it is, even if the source of the threat is a very different one from National Socialism. If the source of the threat is Islamism and its useful idiots on the left, that's a very different source. But what if the end result is the same? If you haven't read any history, if you haven't read Klemperer, you don't really know what to look for. So that's my kind of banal advice. I guess the historian has nothing left in the end to offer but books. But much as I enjoy podcasts, and we're doing one now, books are superior to podcasts.
Well, you have so many to read of yours that if people have not read, for example, The Tower in the Square and so many other of your incredible works, recommend that they go and do that immediately. They can
I am not here to sell books.
I'm selling them.
Let me
I'm
make
hawking
that
them
clear.
for you. Neil, there's no one else that I enjoy talking to more. Thank you so much for
Nelly,
making the time.
come on.
Yeah, maybe. Love her too. But I also love you, so thank you.
Thanks, Barry.